November 10th, 1943, afternoon. Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, Germany's primary Luftwaffe aircraft testing facility. Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche, chief test pilot, walked across the tarmac toward a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt that had been captured 2 weeks earlier. The aircraft sat there like an insult to German engineering sensibilities. Grotesquely fat, ungainly. A flying milk bottle, as German pilots had nicknamed it. Lerche had read the intelligence briefings. American aircraft were crude, mass-produced machines built by a nation more skilled at making refrigerators than fighters. The P-47 was supposedly the perfect example, heavy, unsophisticated, relying on brute force rather than elegant engineering. German fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 were precision instruments. The P-47 was a sledgehammer, or so the briefing said. Lerche was about to discover something that would shake his understanding of engineering philosophy to its core. The Americans hadn't built a crude aircraft. They had built something far more dangerous, a practical one. An aircraft designed not for aces, but for armies. Not for breaking records, but for breaking enemies through sheer overwhelming numbers and relentless operational availability. Within 90 minutes, Lerche would sit at his desk and write a report that would be filed and ignored. But history would prove him right. Germany was building fighters for individual excellence. America was building fighters for industrial war. And in total war, that difference would prove decisive. Hans-Werner Lerche had been flying since childhood. Born in 1916 in Breslau, he'd started with gliders in the early 1930s. Working his way up through sheer determination, despite his family's limited means. When Hitler came to power and Germany began its secret rearmament, Lerche found opportunities opening up. By 1939, he was a test pilot at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's equivalent of the American Wright Field or the British Farnborough. Unlike combat pilots who flew one or two aircraft types extensively, Lerche flew everything. New German prototypes, production aircraft, captured enemy planes. His logbook would eventually record over 120 different aircraft types. He was a trained aeronautical engineer, and his reports were known for brutal technical honesty. When an aircraft was inadequate, he said so. When an enemy design was superior, he documented it. This honesty had made him some enemies among Nazi officials who preferred optimistic assessments to accurate ones. But his expertise was too valuable to dismiss. If Hans-Werner Lerche said an aircraft was good or bad, people listened, even if they didn't always like what they heard. The P-47 Thunderbolt sitting on the Rechlin tarmac had an interesting story. Its pilot, Lieutenant William Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, had gotten lost in bad weather during an escort mission on November 7th, 1943. His entire flight had become desperately low on fuel. The flight leader crash-landed on a beach. Another pilot bailed out over the North Sea. Only one made it back to England. Barely. Roach had spotted what he thought was an airfield in southern England. He landed safely, followed a ground vehicle to a parking area, and shut down his engine. Only then did he realize the horrible truth. He wasn't in England. He was at a Luftwaffe base in Caen, France. German soldiers approached with weapons drawn. Roach was now a prisoner of war. His aircraft, nicknamed Beetle, was now German property. The Luftwaffe had moved quickly. Allied fighters prowled the skies, strafing any valuable target. Beetle was flown inland to Rechlin before American or British fighters could destroy it. Now it sat waiting for evaluation, painted in Luftwaffe camouflage with the code T9+FK, the marking of the famous Circus Rosarius demonstration unit. Lerche had heard the dismissive comments from other pilots. The P-47 was a joke. Too heavy, too big, too American. It represented everything wrong with American design philosophy. Crude, unrefined, relying on massive engines to compensate for poor aerodynamics. But Lerche had learned not to trust first impressions. He'd flown enough captured Allied aircraft to know that British and American engineers were highly competent. If they designed an aircraft this way, they had reasons. His job was to understand those reasons. As he approached Beetle, he noted the sheer size. The radial engine was enormous, the fuselage built around it like a barrel. The landing gear was thick and robust. Everything about the aircraft screamed heavy. German fighters were sleek, elegant, optimized for agility and performance. This thing looked like it had been designed by shipbuilders, not aircraft engineers. Lerch began his walk-around inspection. The construction quality was immediately apparent. Clean welds, precise panel gaps, high-grade materials throughout. This wasn't crude manufacturing. This was sophisticated mass production, and there was a difference. The aircraft had been built to tolerances that German factories, increasingly stretched thin by the war, were struggling to maintain. Lerche climbed into the cockpit and immediately understood why German pilots had been complaining. The cockpit was huge, absolutely enormous compared to the cramped confines of a Bf-109. A German pilot accustomed to his aircraft fitting like a tight glove would feel lost in all this space. But as Lerche settled into the seat, he realized something. This wasn't a flaw, this was deliberate design. In a Bf-109, Lerch had to crouch to avoid continually banging his head on the canopy. The cockpit was so tight that instrument access was difficult, and long missions were physically exhausting. German engineering philosophy prioritized performance. If pilot comfort suffered, that was acceptable. The P-47 cockpit was comfortable, not just adequate, but genuinely comfortable. The seat was well padded. There was room to move, to stretch, to adjust position during long flights. The canopy was high and clear, providing excellent visibility. Everything was within easy reach without straining. Lerche began examining the instruments and controls. Here was something remarkable. The instrument panel used color coding. Red and green sections marked acceptable operating ranges for the engine. A pilot could monitor engine status at a glance without reading the actual numbers. Then Lerche understood why. According to intelligence reports, American fighter units included pilots from multiple countries. Free French, Polish, even some pilots who barely spoke English. The color coding meant that a pilot who couldn't read English could still operate the aircraft safely. Green meant good. Red meant danger. Universal and intuitive. It was brilliant. Not from a pure engineering standpoint, but from an operational standpoint. German instruments required precise understanding of specifications and limits. The P-47 was designed so that a pilot with minimal training could operate it safely. This wasn't crude engineering. This was inclusive engineering. Design that acknowledged human factors. Lerch continued his inspection. The control layout was logical and well organized. The throttle, mixture control, and propeller pitch were all grouped together on the left side. The fuel system controls were clearly labeled. Everything was designed for ease of use. German fighters were designed for expert pilots. The Bf-109 was notoriously difficult to handle on takeoff and landing, with a narrow landing gear that made ground loops common. It took skill to master. The Luftwaffe accepted this because their training program produced skilled pilots. But Lerch knew that by late 1943, the Luftwaffe's training program was collapsing. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal flight time before being thrown into combat. The elaborate training that had produced expert pilots in 1939 and 1940 no longer existed. Germany needed aircraft that novice pilots could fly safely, but they were still building aircraft for aces. Lerch went through the pre-flight checklist. The manual was clear and comprehensive, with step-by-step procedures. German manuals assumed pilot expertise. American manuals assumed pilot ignorance and explained everything in detail. He started the engine. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp roared to life with a distinctive sound. And then Lerch noticed something that would become a recurring theme in his evaluation. The engine ran smoothly, beautifully smoothly. He'd flown enough American aircraft to recognize this pattern. American engines were consistently smooth and reliable. German engines, particularly late in the war, were increasingly temperamental. Manufacturing quality varied between factories. Replacement parts didn't always fit properly. Engines that ran perfectly when new developed problems after minimal use. The R-2800 idled like it could run forever. No vibration, no rough spots, no concerning sounds, just smooth, powerful operation. This was mass production at a level Germany couldn't match. Building one perfect engine in a laboratory was one thing. Building thousands of consistently reliable engines was something else entirely. Lerche received clearance and taxied toward the runway. Here was another revelation. The P-47's landing gear was broad and robust. The tail wheel locked into place, keeping the aircraft tracking straight. Taxiing was easy, visibility was good, and the aircraft felt stable. In a Bf-109, ground handling was a constant challenge. The narrow landing gear made the aircraft unstable. Visibility over the nose was poor. Inexperienced pilots frequently ground looped during taxi or landing, damaging the aircraft even without enemy action. The Luftwaffe accepted these characteristics as the price of high performance. The P-47 was designed to be operated from rough forward airfields by pilots of varying skill levels. The robust landing gear could absorb hard landings. The good ground handling meant fewer accidents. In his memoir, Lerche would later write about forgetting to lock the tail wheel once and nearly ground looping, but catching it just in time. The fact that he could catch it, that the aircraft was forgiving enough to save, would have been impossible in a Bf-109. Lerche lined up on the runway and advanced the throttle. The acceleration was impressive. The massive engine pushed the heavy fighter forward with authority. The takeoff run was longer than a German fighter, but not excessively so. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, and Lerche retracted the landing gear. Climbing to altitude, Lerche tested handling characteristics. The P-47 was not agile in the German sense. It didn't turn tightly. It didn't have the instantaneous response of a Bf-109 or FW-190. But it was stable, predictable, and solid. Lerche experimented with the flaps at safe altitude, as he'd noted in his memoir. The hydraulic system worked smoothly. Everything functioned as designed. There were no quirks, no unexpected behaviors, no systems that required careful management. This was the pattern emerging. The P-47 wasn't the most agile fighter. It wasn't the fastest at low altitude. It didn't excel in traditional dogfighting. But it was competent in all areas, reliable in all systems, and forgiving of pilot errors. German fighters were temperamental thoroughbreds. The P-47 was a workhorse, and Lerche was beginning to understand that in industrial warfare, workhorses won. At altitude, Lerche tested performance. Above 15,000 feet, the P-47's turbo-supercharger came into its element. The aircraft accelerated smoothly and maintained power where German fighters were gasping in the thin air. The dive performance was impressive. The roll rate was excellent for an aircraft this size. Lerche flew for about 90 minutes, putting the Thunderbolt through various maneuvers. The aircraft never surprised him negatively. Everything worked as it should. The engine never faltered. The controls remained responsive. The systems remained functional. And that was when Lerche understood the deeper truth. The P-47 wasn't designed to be the ultimate fighter. It was designed to be the ultimate operational fighter. There was a difference, and it was profound. German engineers designed for peak performance. American engineers designed for sustained operations. A Bf-109 in perfect condition, flown by an expert pilot, might outperform a P-47 in a dogfight. But how often was a German fighter in perfect condition? How often were pilots experts? How often could mechanics perform the precise maintenance required? The P-47 was designed assuming that maintenance would be performed by mechanics of varying skill levels, using parts from different production batches, under field conditions, possibly under enemy fire. It was designed assuming that pilots might be tired, stressed, wounded, or undertrained. It was designed assuming that aircraft would take battle damage and need to keep flying. Every design decision made sense once Lerche understood this philosophy. The robust construction, the forgiving handling, the intuitive controls, the reliable engine, all of it served operational availability. Lerche returned to Rechlin and landed. The landing was straightforward, the robust landing gear absorbing the touchdown smoothly. He taxied back to the hangar and shut down the engine. Ground crew members gathered around, eager for his assessment. What did he think of the grotesque American fighter? Lurcher climbed out and stood looking at the aircraft for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised them. "It's the best designed operational fighter I've ever flown." The mechanics looked confused. Best designed? It was huge, heavy, inelegant. How could it be well designed? "It's not designed for performance," Lurch explained. "It's designed for operations. And there's a difference." That evening, Lurch sat at his desk and began writing his technical report. This was always the most important part of his job. Flying the aircraft was one thing. Understanding what it meant strategically was another. He organized his report into sections: performance, handling, systems, and strategic assessment. In the performance section, he documented the facts objectively. The P-47 was fast at altitude, slow at low altitude. Dive performance was excellent. Turning performance was adequate, but not exceptional. Rate of climb was good. High altitude performance was outstanding due to the turbo supercharger. In the handling section, he noted the stable, predictable characteristics: easy ground handling, forgiving flight behavior, good visibility, comfortable cockpit for long-duration missions. In the systems section, he detailed the color-coded instruments, the intuitive control layout, the robust construction, the smooth, reliable engine. But it was in the strategic assessment section that Lurch wrote something that would later prove prophetic, even though his report would be filed and ignored. The P-47 Thunderbolt represents a fundamentally different design philosophy from German fighters. German aircraft are optimized for peak performance and assume expert pilots and maintenance. The P-47 is optimized for operational reliability and assumes average pilots and field maintenance. This aircraft is designed to be operated in large numbers by pilots of varying skill levels. The forgiving handling means fewer accidents. The robust construction means more aircraft return from missions. The reliable engine means more uptime and less maintenance. The intuitive controls mean faster training. Most significantly, every design decision prioritizes sustained operations over peak performance. The Americans have not built the best fighter. They have built the most operational fighter, and they can produce it in numbers we cannot match. Lurcher paused, considering how to phrase his conclusion. He knew it would be controversial, possibly even dangerous. But accuracy was more important than comfort. Assessment. The P-47 is not crude engineering. It is sophisticated operational engineering. Germany builds fighters for individual excellence. America builds fighters for industrial war. If the Americans can field hundreds of these aircraft flown by adequately trained pilots, our numerical and qualitative advantages will be negated through sheer operational availability. Recommendation: German fighter design philosophy must incorporate operational reliability as a primary requirement, not a secondary consideration. We cannot win an attrition war against an enemy that can keep more aircraft operational more consistently. He signed the report and submitted it through channels. Lurch's report made its way up the command structure. It was read, discussed, and ultimately filed. The conclusion was dismissed as overly pessimistic. The P-47 was still a crude American design. German fighters were superior. End of discussion. But Lurch's predictions began coming true almost immediately. By early 1944, P-47 Thunderbolts appeared over Germany in massive numbers. They escorted American bomber formations deep into the Reich. And they kept coming, day after day, mission after mission. German fighters intercepted them and sometimes shot them down. But the next day, there were more P-47s. Always more. Luftwaffe pilots reported frustration. They would damage P-47s that should have been destroyed, only to watch them fly home. They would shoot down American pilots one day and encounter different American pilots in new P-47s the next day. The supply seemed endless. Meanwhile, German fighter production was struggling. Allied bombing disrupted factories. Material shortages forced compromises. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were drafted and replaced by forced labor. Aircraft that should have been reliable developed problems. Engines failed prematurely. Systems malfunctioned. The operational availability gap widened. The Luftwaffe might have more aircraft on paper, but fewer were actually flying on any given day. American units maintained higher operational readiness because their aircraft were designed for it. Lurch continued his work at Rechlin, flying more captured aircraft and writing more reports. He flew a captured P-51 Mustang and was impressed by its combination of range and performance. He flew Spitfires, Hurricanes, Soviet fighters. Each evaluation reinforced the same conclusion. Allied aircraft prioritized operational reliability. The P-47 Beetle that Lurch had flown eventually went to Circus Rosarius, a special Luftwaffe demonstration unit. This unit traveled to frontline fighter bases with captured Allied aircraft, showing German pilots what they were facing and how to fight them. Ironically, this meant that German pilots got extensive briefings on the strengths and weaknesses of the P-47, but their own aircraft weren't being redesigned to match its operational advantages. The war ground on. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was in collapse. Not because German pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the industrial base couldn't sustain operations. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. New pilots received minimal training because fuel for training flights wasn't available. Replacement parts were scarce. Everything that Lurch had identified as the American advantage, operational sustainability, was absent from the German war effort. Hans-Werner Lerche survived the war. His skill as a test pilot and his careful flying meant he never crashed or seriously damaged an aircraft throughout his entire career. This was an extraordinary record, particularly given that he'd flown over 120 different types, many of them captured enemy aircraft without manuals or prior familiarization. After Germany's surrender, Lurch was interrogated by Allied technical intelligence officers. They were fascinated by his experiences flying captured Allied aircraft. They found his reports in German files and asked him about his assessments. "You concluded that American aircraft were superior not in performance, but in operational design," an American officer said. "That's an unusual assessment." Lurch nodded. "It was the most important assessment. Your pilots weren't necessarily better than ours. Your aircraft weren't necessarily faster or more maneuverable, but you could keep more aircraft flying more consistently. You could train more pilots. You could sustain operations that we couldn't sustain." Was this apparent when you flew the P-47? Immediately. Every design decision made sense once I understood the philosophy. You weren't building for dogfighting supremacy. You were building for sustained operations. The comfortable cockpit meant pilots could fly 8-hour missions. The forgiving handling meant fewer accidents. The reliable engine meant less maintenance downtime. The robust construction meant battle-damaged aircraft returned home. Did German leadership understand this? Lurcher laughed bitterly. My report was filed. The assessment was that I'd been demoralized by flying the enemy aircraft and had lost my objectivity. German engineering was superior. American engineering was crude. That was the official position, and any evidence to the contrary was dismissed. If Germany had adopted American design philosophy, would it have made a difference? Lurch considered the question carefully. By 1943, probably not. Germany's industrial base couldn't match American or Soviet production, regardless of design philosophy. But if we had prioritized operational reliability from the beginning, our fighters would have been more effective throughout the war. We lost many aircraft to accidents, mechanical failures, and maintenance issues that better design could have prevented. The interrogation revealed a pattern. Lurch wasn't the only German engineer who had recognized Allied engineering advantages. Many had written reports. Many had made recommendations. All had been ignored because the conclusions contradicted Nazi ideology about German superiority. The final production numbers told the story. The United States produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war. At peak production, one Thunderbolt rolled off the assembly line every hour. Germany produced about 36,000 single-engine fighters total across all types during the entire war, and German production was constantly disrupted by bombing. More importantly, American aircraft maintained higher operational readiness rates. A unit with 100 P-47s might have 85 or 90 available for operations on any given day. A German unit with 100 fighters might have 60 or 70 available, with the rest grounded for maintenance, lack of parts, or fuel shortages. The multiplication was devastating. More aircraft produced, times higher availability rates, times better sustainability, equaled overwhelming numerical superiority at the point of contact. In his later years, Lerche wrote his memoir, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II. The book provided detailed accounts of his experiences flying everything from B-17 bombers to P-51 fighters. His assessment of the P-47 included detailed technical observations and his famous quote about the comfortable cockpit compared to the cramped Bf-109. What makes Lerche's story important isn't just that he flew captured aircraft. Many pilots on both sides did that. What makes it important is that he understood what he was seeing. As a trained engineer and experienced test pilot, he could evaluate not just whether an aircraft was good or bad, but why it was designed that way and what that revealed about industrial philosophy. The P-47 Beetle that Lerche flew in November 1943 represented more than just one captured fighter. It represented a completely different approach to warfare. Germany approached World War II as if it were still World War I, where individual excellence and superior technology could win battles. America approached it as industrial war, where sustained operations and overwhelming numbers would win campaigns. German fighters were magnificent machines when they worked perfectly. The Bf-109 and FW-190 were genuinely excellent aircraft, but when they worked perfectly, became increasingly rare. Manufacturing quality declined, maintenance became difficult, parts became scarce, fuel became unavailable. The P-47, by contrast, kept flying. It absorbed damage and returned home. It operated from rough fields. It could be maintained by mechanics of average skill. It could be flown safely by pilots with minimal training, and there were always more of them. Lerche had recognized this immediately. His report in November 1943 accurately predicted what would happen over the next 18 months. But his report was filed and forgotten, because the truth was inconvenient. If you found this deep dive into engineering philosophy and design decisions compelling, make sure you're subscribed. History is full of moments where the obvious truth was ignored because it contradicted comfortable beliefs. Hans Werner Lerche flew the P-47 Thunderbolt and immediately understood that it represented a superior approach to fighter design. Not superior performance, but superior operations. His reward was to be ignored and to watch his predictions come true as the Luftwaffe was ground down by an enemy that could simply keep more aircraft flying more consistently. The lesson is timeless. In sustained conflict, reliability beats peak performance. Operational availability beats maximum capability. And design philosophy matters more than individual excellence. The P-47 wasn't the best fighter of World War II, but it might have been the best designed fighter, because it was designed not for air shows or test flights or record breaking. It was designed for war, and in war, the side that can keep fighting longest usually wins.